Chapter 18, Black Raven. At Kadic Academy, Dido was watching the time. It was 26 minutes past midnight. The boss of the men in black opened the radio connection with the pilot of the fighter bomber in good time. "Madam," said a cold, masculine voice. "I will have more than completed the objective within 3 minutes and 50 seconds. Dido felt that this was the most difficult decision that she has ever had to make in her whole career. She was about ready to give the order to attack. She trembled, but she needed to stop the terrorists at any cost. But she felt that the words were now refusing to form in her mouth. "Get ready to destroy the factory," she managed to mutter at last. Grigory Nyctopoulos had regained consciousness, but he found himself shoved up in a corner, tied up and gagged. His clothes reeked of smoke. The man was pale and had an expression typical of someone who had had a bad day. Jeremy smiled wide at Weasel. The boy had noticed that someone in the maintenance shaft was trying to figure out how to get inside, so he immediately opened the door, freeing the agent, and the man was now aiming his weapon at Grigory Nyctopoulos. An expression of satisfaction could be seen on his face. Jeremy felt relieved as well. He had traced the movements of his friends thanks to the laptops that were still connected to the supercomputer. In reality though, it was XANA who deserved the thanks for picking up on his presence in the real world and regularly sending detailed files his way at each crucial moment. He had already described how Aelita and Eva had saved Professor Hertz and the other adults, and how Ulrich and Richard had taken down the majority of the soldiers, and finally, how Yumi and Odd had confronted Mago. The boy turned towards memory. "Why aren't we heading to the ground floor of the factory?" he said. "That's where all the others are, including Aelita." The woman gave a timid smile. "Well, it's just that, I don't know if I'm ready. I mean, I'm dying to see her. But she won't even remember me. She might think that I abandoned her. Maybe she hates me." Jeremy sighed. "Why must adults always be so complicated? Aelita doesn't know you. It's true. But she's done everything she can to find you, and now, she probably feels all alone. You need to run and go see her, hug her and get to know her." The boy was interrupted by the computer at his feet as it began to emit an insistent alarm. Jeremy saw XANA's face on the screen. He was still in the tower on Lyoko, and had a somber expression. "Did something happen?" Jeremy asked him. XANA nodded his head. "When you electrified the ground to stun Grigory, the internet connection to the factory was lost, and we've been isolated." Jeremy nodded. He'd known about that, but he'd figured it wasn't an urgent issue. It was more important for them to have taken out the Green Phoenix agent. The connection came back for a brief moment. The young man with blonde hair continued. "Just long enough for me to intercept a communication from Dido. Actually, I think you were totally correct." "About what?" asked Jeremy with a worried tone of voice. "About the government having a plan B in case they weren't able to stop the terrorists. I think that a plane is preparing to blow up the factory." "What?" cried Jeremy. "And when are they going to attack?" "If my calculations are correct, in 2 minutes more or less. Unfortunately, we lost the internet again, and it would take hours for me to re-establish the connection. You need to find another way to get us in contact with Dido ASAP." Aelita was sitting at the center of the ground floor of the factory on the remains of what had once been the emerald green, nomadic tent of Hannibal Mago. The factory was full of activity. The men in black were tending to the injured, giving them first aid, handcuffing the rest of Mago's soldiers and deploying men who were still in condition to work to do something useful. She was with the people she loved, Yumi, Ulrich, Eva and Odd, who had earlier come back out from the scanners, now without his powers. None of them spoke a single word. They didn't feel like it was the right time yet to speak of their adventures. Now was the time to take in the battlefield, breathe deeply, and enjoy the feeling of their freedom and accomplishments. Everything was perfect. Or rather, it would have been perfect if the last person they were missing was there, Jeremy. Aelita wanted to see him again, hold him in her arms, and tell him how grateful she was for everything that he did. Of course, Jeremy's style was kind of reserved and serious, almost secretive. But without him, the kids wouldn't have been able to materialize into the real world, and then, what happened could have been terrible. When the doors to the elevator opened, Aelita turned towards it with a large smile. She remained frozen in place. Jeremy wasn't alone. With him was another agent from the Men in Black, Weasel, and a woman with red hair who. Jeremy told me that she was here, the young girl thought to herself with heartache. But up until now, I was reluctant to believe it. Aelita was about to step in their direction when Jeremy began to yell out, "A radio! Someone give me a radio! Quick! 43 seconds until we reach the objective, ma'am," sounded the static riddled voice of the pilot in Dido's ears. "Is authorization to open fire granted?" On Dido's screen in front of her was a small, black dial showing the countdown. 40. 39. "I must release the bomb," continued the pilot. "Or else I'll need to make a large turn to return to the factory for another shot." Dido felt the pressure of the moment and knew that the same concern as hers was behind the pilot's stoic voice. But she was the one who had to support the weight of this decision. "Okay," she murmured. "Prepare yourself. Authorization for attack at X hour granted." "Roger." At the same moment, Maggie's face appeared on her screen above the pilot's. The secretary seemed stressed, almost distraught. "Ma'am, stop Black Raven." They succeeded. The children succeeded. Dido couldn't believe her ears. There were only 21 seconds remaining before the attack. At only 18 seconds left, she reopened her connection with the pilot. As she spoke with him, her heart was beating so strongly that she couldn't even hear her own voice. Jeremy placed the radio on the ground, one the leader of the frogmen had given him. "I did it," he spoke softly. Ulrich gave him an affectionate punch to the shoulder. Everything that had just happened once the boy had arrived back on scene had been a complete surprise to them, and they didn't understand an iota of what had just taken place. "Mind explaining, genius?" Jeremy gave a timid smile to his father and fixed his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "Right, well, I managed to tell Dido to abort the attack. There was a plane that was about to bomb the factory." "What?" blurted Odd, jumping to his feet. Plane," Lone Wolf completed his sentence for him. "Operation Black Raven. I should have guessed that Dido would see herself obligated to put it in action." Jeremy raised a finger towards the ceiling. "Do you hear that? That's the noise of the fighter bomber that was about to disintegrate all of us." Odd broke out into applause. "Bravo," he cried. "For Jeremy, hip hip. Hooray." Aelita was watching the scene unfold from the corner of her eye. She felt it must be something important, however, she wasn't able to concentrate. The woman who had come out from the lift with Jeremy hadn't left her eyes. The cascade of red hair that went down to her shoulders and seemed to shine of its own light was the same color of her own in the real world when she wasn't in her elf form on Lyoko. The woman had the same eyes as her. And the same fine lips that Aelita saw when she looked in the mirror every morning. The nose, however, was different, as well as the shape of her face. The woman's face was softer and more friendly. Aelita wanted to approach the woman, ask her if it was true, if it was really her. Yet, despite it all, she found herself unable to move or even to smile. It was as if an invisible storm was roaring inside of her, causing her to be frozen in place. A small, beating knot that Aelita felt in her chest knew perfectly well why she wasn't able to speak. This small, painful knot was telling her, "Don't get your hopes up. Don't kid yourself." She had already experienced it before. She had woken up in the supercomputer after a decade of sleep, and found herself all alone. So all alone that she could no longer even remember having parents. She then discovered that her father was still alive, trapped on Lyoko in the form of a sphere of energy. But Aelita was only able to spend a few minutes with him before he sacrificed himself to neutralize XANA back when the creature was still lacking human emotions. She later recovered the video in the hermitage on which her father revealed to her that her mother was still alive, and that Aelita needed to find her. He had given her the necklace. And again. Things had been that way for such a long way, struggling, believing, wishing, and then seeing all her hopes dashed, blown apart like a castle of cards destroyed by a gust of wind. She couldn't do it anymore. Aelita had had enough of suffering. She was no longer able to take the first step. She was afraid. Even if Jeremy had said that it was her. She felt her head turn. Around her, the world no longer existed. There was no factory, no men in black, no terrorists. Only herself and the woman with red hair. Very slowly, she saw her bring a hand to her neck, pull out a golden chain from under her shirt and hold it between her fingers. At this same instant in time, Aelita's necklace began to vibrate. Without completely understanding yet, without wanting to believe it yet, the young girl raised the necklace to her eyes. The A and the sailor's knot were shining intensely. The pink-haired woman nodded her head slowly. Aelita realized that she couldn't see clearly. Her eyes were full of tears. The woman took a step forward. The small knot in Aelita's chest melted like an ice cube under the sun, and the young girl opened her arms wide and began to run. Sobbing, she threw herself in the woman's arms. She felt great. She felt at home. This was her mother. Chapter 19, Code Down. Jeremy understood. Aelita and her mother needed some time alone. They had 20 years to catch up on. Now that they'd found each other again, there was no more room for anyone else. It was as if an invisible firewall was isolating them from the rest of the world. The boy shrugged. He was dying to be able to talk to his friend, but he would have to wait. And, either way, he had plenty of other things on his plate. Jeremy began to debate with Lone Wolf and the leader of the Frogmen. They needed to find the necessary material for building a makeshift bridge that would reconnect the factory to the mainland. They needed to drain the river to find Mago. Dido was about to arrive with the rest of her agents, who during this time had apprehended the terrorists at the Hermitage. There were some seriously injured men among the men in black as well as the Green Phoenix soldiers, and they needed to be taken to hospital as soon as possible. And there were other injured that could be taken care of immediately, through handing out bandages and disinfectant. The children watched the scene from a distance. Besides Odd, the others were still Lyoko Warriors, and with them were the creatures XANA had created. They felt out of place. What's more, the large, black panther had seemed to become affectionate of Richard, and its gigantic head was resting against the young man's shoulder. Jeremy smiled. "What are you waiting for? We haven't finished yet, and your powers could be useful. Ulrich, Eva, you two can fly, so you help transport the steel cables to the riverbank to construct the new bridge. Yumi, to complete the bridge will need some of the gangways the Green Phoenix installed here, and your fans are perfect for cutting the columns holding them up. Odd, we'll need medical supplies. You and Richard can take the panther and find some faster. Search the factory from top to bottom." The children stood at attention and imitated a military salute before getting to work. Jeremy turned around to see the stupefied looks Lone Wolf and the leader of the Frogmen were giving. He smiled, somewhat embarrassed. "Well," he said, "you have your team and I have mine." At 4 o'clock in the morning, a long stream of black limousines appeared at the end of the road and stopped in front of the new iron bridge. They were welcomed by Lone Wolf, Professor Hertz and Jeremy. The boy was exhausted, but he knew that he couldn't get even a wink of sleep tonight. He needed to hold on a little longer. The first limousine's engine stopped, and the driver got out to open the passenger door. An energetic-looking adult woman with short, blonde hair got out. In her hand she held a small suitcase, handcuffed to her wrist. Lone Wolf stood at attention, while Hertz stayed motionless. Dido nodded towards them, then approached Jeremy. "You must be the young Belpois," she exclaimed. "Thank you for warning me in time." The boy tried to reply, but the woman had already turned to her agent. I think it's time to have a private meeting, she declared. I want a detailed report on everything that happened tonight, and I've prepared some instructions. Yes, ma'am. I also want to be part of this little conversation, Hertz cut in. I'm not certain about what you have in mind, Dido. The boss of the men in black shot the professor a stony look. Sorry. From now on, this mission is under the jurisdiction of the men in black, and you deserted them years ago. Lone Wolf gave a satisfied smile. Come with me, ma'am. I've prepared a room for our meeting. Jeremy tried to protest, but Dido and the secret agent had already crossed the temporary bridge. Hertz firmly gripped the boy's shoulder and gave him a sad smile. Let it go, she said quietly. Unfortunately, she's right. We've played our part, but now it's their turn. What do you think Dido will decide to do? The professor didn't respond, but deep worry glistened in her eyes. Jeremy hoped that Odd had followed his instructions carefully. Odd was furious. In the span of just 2 days he had been forced to probe through the sewers in a wetsuit, take part in an assault on the Hermitage, hide in the mirror, transfer himself from there to Lyoko and then attack the factory to vanquish the Green Phoenix once and for all. Everything was over now. They had won. He was a hero, and that means that he deserved applause and praise, and a little alone time with Eva, right? Wrong. Jeremy, who had done nothing but research on his computer this whole time, had suddenly started acting like the leader. Odd, do this, do that. Odd, get into the air ducts and get to the room where Dido will meet with the adults. The air duct was very narrow and humid and full of dust. The pieces of metal it was composed of were stuck together using rusty screws that scratched against his skin. He could only see a meter ahead of him. Why the heck had he accepted? Well, in part, he felt flattered to have been chosen for this difficult mission. Aside from Jeremy, he was the only one who didn't have his Lyoko powers, and so he could slip in and out of places without being noticed. But, even without his powers, Odd was incredibly agile, and he knew how to be silent when he needed to. But there was one other reason why he had been pushed to say yes. Although nobody had ever said it out loud, the whole gang knew that Jeremy was the boss. Not because he was superior to them, but because he had great instincts and the ability to resolve truly exceptional problems. In time, Odd had learned to unconditionally trust his friend. If Jeremy says it's important, then it's really important. The vent formed a 90-degree angle in front of him. The boy peered around the corner, then crawled towards the light at the end. He froze as he heard the sound of chairs moving around on the floor and some small coughs. A moment later, he continued towards the small grate at the end of the conduit. He saw the factory director's office, sparsely furnished with 2 chairs either side of an enormous desk. Lone Wolf waited standing up, while Dido was seated. She used a small key to unlock the handcuffs attaching the suitcase to her wrist. Then, she opened it and took out a pair of gloves. They were made of leather, and had a screen on the back of the right glove, with a series of colored cables connected from it to the fingertips. Odd had already seen this device. It was the memory-snatching machine invented by Professor Hopper. The same machine that had been used on his father to permanently erase all trace of their memories of the supercomputer. This operation was classified code Red Tabula Rasa. Odd repeated Dido's words in his head so he could relay them to Jeremy. Tabula Rasa? What could that mean? What priority, said Lone Wolf, opening his eyes wide. Absolute. That includes myself as well. Before coming here I erased the memories of the agents in the Hermitage, the teachers and all the students and parents who were at Kadic during the recent events. Total elimination of everything that has happened these past few days. Now it's the factory's turn. Once I've taken care of all the people here, I'll communicate the results to headquarters and use the machine on myself. And this way, nobody will know anything about the supercomputer's existence anymore. Except the government bigwigs, of course, the agent concluded. Exactly, Dido confirmed. Lone Wolf seemed perplexed. And what will happen after that? A new squadron has begun to search for Mago. A team of scientists will then be chosen to study the supercomputer and find a way to adapt the first city. This way, the agency can use Hopper's weapon for its own means. But we won't remember anything. Dido shrugged. The operation was moved to higher circles. The bosses don't want to run any risk. There have already been enough problems. Lone Wolf stood and took the memory-snatching gloves his boss held out to him. "Who do I start with?" he asked. "The terrorists first. Then all our agents and the children and their parents afterwards. And finally, you and I. I've already called in a cleanup team. They'll arrive in a few hours and escort us back home. Mago's men will end up in prison, and to us, absolutely nothing would have happened. But the cleanup team, they'll be in charge of cleaning up the factory without knowing what went on here. The secret will be kept." Lone Wolf gave a weak smile. "Ma'am, given that I won't remember anything soon, I want to tell you that it's been a real honor participating in this operation under your command." "Thank you, Lone Wolf." The meeting ended. Odd retreated into the conduit. He couldn't believe his ears. The men in black were planning to erase everyone's memory. Even theirs. He had to warn Jeremy immediately. "I can't leave my mother," Aelita whined. She was beginning to get very annoyed with Jeremy. After all, after so many adventures and misadventures, she had finally been able to hold her in her arms again. She had a family once more, and she had kept the promise she made to her father. How dare the boy now come and ask her to? "Haven't you got your priorities straight?" he retorted. "If we wait a little longer, it'll be too late. I said it's out of the question." Jeremy sighed. Aelita saw the worry etched on her friend's face, but she wasn't about to let him do it. "Okay," he finally gave in, whispering. "Ask Anthea, to come with us. But do it softly and quietly. So nobody sees you." The men in black were grouping up all the survivors of the great battle and escorting them to the cafeteria. At that moment, nobody was paying attention to the small group of kids. Jeremy approached Aelita's splendid unicorn. "We can't bring you with us," he murmured, "but we're going to need your help." He whispered some instructions into the unicorn's ear, and then repeated them to Ulrich's manta ray. And Odd's panther. The creatures galloped off to create chaos among the adults, who were obeying the men in black's orders without question. Taking advantage of the distraction, Anthea and the children ran to the lift and headed underground. Aelita was impatient, and all the others seemed nervous. They had heard Odd's hurried explanations about Dido's terrifying plan: erase all their memories, send scientists to take advantage of Hopper's supercomputer for military means. The only one who appeared calm was Jeremy. Worried and a little sad, but calm. "Can you tell us exactly what you have in mind?" Aelita burst out. "Seriously, just trust me. I'll tell you when the moment arrives." The children went down to the second floor, the scanner room. Then, Jeremy, Anthea, Richard and Odd went back up a floor. Aelita observed the columns, somewhat dubious. "You'll see, Jeremy must have a plan," Yumi reassured her. A few moments later, they heard their friend's voice over the speakers around the room. "Sorry if I've been overly mysterious," Jeremy explained, "but we really don't have much time. I've just cut the cables to the lift, so the men in black can't reach us here. For now, at least. I don't know what you think about it, guys, but I haven't the slightest intention of forgetting about our all adventures." "Of course not." Richard's voice crackled. "It was the most beautiful and incredible thing that's ever happened to me. Plus," continued Jeremy, "it's not right for Anthea to have to lose her memory. She and Aelita have just found each other again. And it's not right that the supercomputer falls into the hands of the men in black. Professor Hopper fought as hard as he could to ensure that wouldn't happen. So, what do you propose we do?" asked Yumi. "Before anything else, you need to come back to the real world. And attacking each other until you lose all your life points doesn't seem like the best solution." "Darn right it's not. Odd immediately exclaimed over the speakers. It really hurts, believe me. Jeremy gave a little laugh. You just need to enter the scanners, and you'll rematerialize in the real world. Aelita, you need to go in last, please. The children stayed still for a few seconds, then Ulrich smiled. It would be pretty useful for my father to forget everything, he said. We may have made up over these past few days, but I don't feel comfortable with his secret agent role. If he can't remember all these adventures, with a little luck, he and I can start from scratch. I'm thinking the same thing about my family, Odd added. I really hope that my parents won't remember anything. If not, they'll choke me to death worrying about everything I've done or am doing. The scanners opened and Ulrich, Yumi and Eva entered at the same time. Moments later, they came back out again completely transformed. No more swords, fans or exaggerated rock star makeup. They were just 3 children in jeans with eyes droopy from fatigue. Aelita, Jeremy said over the speakers, now it's your turn. XANA is waiting for you. The girl entered the scanner. When she opened her eyes again, Aelita found that she was in a tower on Lyoko. Its dark walls seemed to rattle around her, and by her side was the blonde-haired teen. Why did you bring me here? Aelita murmured. In her ear, she heard Jeremy clear his throat. Well, you see, I wanted to tell you, but I think I'm the one who should explain everything to her, XANA finished for him. After all, it concerns me. Do you remember the code down? Aelita nodded before replying. It's my father's security program. If the code down is loaded in the supercomputer and I activate it from a tower like this one, Lyoko will auto-destruct definitively, and I'll die. It's impossible to create a backup copy of my new personality, so I'll simply cease to exist. Aelita looked at XANA. She didn't understand. This conversation was giving her chills. She just wanted to be happy. She had just found her mother, and was about to start a new life with her. So why are XANA and Jeremy intent on scaring her like this? I made a promise. Do you remember? She cried. I swore that I would never activate the code down. Her words shook in the silence of the tower. The girl felt XANA's eyes stare at her fixedly. Now she began to understand. And with understanding rose a cry of rage so loud it made Jeremy feel nauseous. Jeremy, she yelled. What does all this mean? Just what are you planning on doing? The boy took several minutes before responding. XANA and I have talked about it, and it's our only option. If the supercomputer falls into the hands of the men in black, they'll use it as a weapon. The first city will become what your father always loathed. We can't let that happen. Jeremy is right, XANA confirmed. He created me to stop humans from using the city as a weapon. I don't know how I managed to forget such an important task, but now I know that I must fulfill my purpose. Save humanity. And I need you in order to do it. Aelita fell to her knees. She didn't want to listen to this. She didn't want to cry. She raised her gaze to meet XANA's. Her eyes were full of indignation. Don't ask me to do such a thing. Not you, not Jeremy. I won't activate the code down. I won't destroy Lyoko. And I won't kill you either. Aelita. I said no. Aelita, it's what your father would have wanted, said Jeremy. XANA smiled. He sacrificed himself to save humanity from Lyoko. Now it's my turn to make the same sacrifice. Aelita didn't reply. A screen appeared in front of her, floating above the ground. Jeremy, Anthea, Richard and Odd held on tight as they climbed down the maintenance tunnel to the second underground floor. They entered the room just as the scanner doors opened to bring Aelita back to Earth. The girl's head was hanging low. She wasn't dressed as an elf, and her short hair was the same fire-red color as her mother's. She raised a hand to gesture for Yumi to not come any closer, as the girl had approached to try and console her. She took long strides towards Jeremy. The boy was waiting with his hands in his pant pockets. He didn't know what to say. He felt guilty. He had brought Aelita back to the real world an instant before Lyoko had imploded on itself, vanishing into nothing. The supercomputer was still turned on, but it no longer held any virtual worlds, or even an operating system. Its immense calculating power had become useless, patiently awaiting something that would never come back. As the complex program was bringing Aelita back to her physical body, Jeremy had seen the dying scream from the collapsing tower. XANA had motionlessly awaited his destiny. Until he had suddenly raised his head. Jeremy was dumbfounded to see small, shining diamonds flow from his eyes. They were tears. XANA was crying. Jeremy opened his arms to welcome Aelita home, and the girl threw her head over his shoulder, sobbing. "Do you know what he said before I left?" she whispered in a broken voice. "He said, 'Remember me.'" Jeremy gave a weak smile. "That's what you have to do. What we all have to do." The code down had destroyed Lyoko. XANA was no more. Now it was really the end. Dido put on the gloves of the memory-snatching machine. Her face resembled a stone mask. She and Jeremy were in the director's office at the factory, seated at opposite ends of the desk. On the table, the small suitcase was still open. A hallowing silence reigned throughout the factory. All the people involved in the terrible affair had lost their memories, and were staring blankly at the ceiling. Everyone except Dido, Jeremy, and his friends. The boy knew that the woman could force him to have his memories eliminated. She could also force it on Anthea, Richard, and the others. He had to change her mind. "So," said Dido, "you've shut down the supercomputer." "Not exactly," Jeremy replied. "All we've really done is erase all the data it contained. The computer is now nothing more than an empty, useless carcass. Lyoko no longer exists." "Correct. Nor do the first city in XANA." "Correct." Jeremy tried to read the woman's expression, noticed the slightest sign of rage or a sad smile. But there was nothing. Dido seemed completely unreadable. "And why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did I ask Aelita to use the code down? It's simple. It's what Hopper would have wanted us to do. The professor spent his whole life fighting to keep the supercomputer out of your hands, as well as the terrorists. From his point of view, there's no difference between the two of you. That's not." Jeremy didn't let her continue. "Don't you understand, ma'am? You all want to use the supercomputer as a weapon. Mago wanted to conquer the world, and your agency probably intended to use the robot soldiers for legitimate means in official wars, but what difference is there? In both cases, innocent people end up dying. And Hopper would never have allowed that." Dido sighed, and this time Jeremy could see a shadow of fatigue on her face. "I imagine there's no way to undo what you've done." "Absolutely none. And if you don't trust me on that, you can send the code down to your scientists. The program is definitive and can't be undone. So you've left me with no alternative. More or less. But we're sure we've made the right decision." As he said these words, Jeremy gave the boss of the men in black a look of defiance. "And there's something else," he added. "None of us want to lose our memories. This is our great adventure, and Anthea, well, I think she's suffered enough these past decades, don't you? It's not right to take away her memories of her husband with the stroke of a pen, or the ones of when she finally held her daughter in her arms again." With a calm gesture, Dido placed the memory-snatching gloves in the suitcase. "The cleanup team will arrive in a few minutes," she said softly. "They're agents trained to resolve complicated situations like this one. They've been ordered to erase my memory, given that I must be the only person to keep even the slightest memory of these events. And then they'll take care of everything else. They'll erase all trace of the terrorists and take them to prison. They'll accompany your parents to their respective homes, and you and your friends to the school. And finally they'll close up the factory, blocking the access road with a wall, resolving the sewer flood and all the rest. It will be as if these past few days had never happened. Jeremy lowered his head. They'll keep you under surveillance for some time, Dido continued. The memory snatching machine has some side effects: confusion, dead stares, speaking nonsense, and other things of the sort. The boy looked at the woman, not understanding what she was getting at. I know, but... So, try your best to act that way, and don't let yourselves be noticed, she interrupted. When the cleanup team arrives, pretend you're all a little disoriented, let them guide you to Kadic like sheep and try to not stand out among the adults. And of course, don't get involved in any more dodgy dealings. I won't remember your faces, so I can't help you even if I want to. Okay? Jeremy couldn't believe his ears. When he had come into the office, he hadn't any hope of convincing Dido. Why are you doing all this? He asked the woman. To be honest, I don't at all like what's about to happen. Tonight I was forced to make the most difficult decision of my life, and I realized that it had been the wrong decision. When everything turned out well thanks to you and your friends, I let out a sigh of relief. To then realize that it was for nothing. Of course, we're not the Green Phoenix, but either way you're right. In the end, the ends we would use the supercomputer for wouldn't be all that different to theirs. As she spoke this last sentence, Dido offered him her hand. Consider it a gift from a friend, all right? Jeremy shook the hand with enthusiasm. All right, he said. And to celebrate our friendship, I have one last favor to ask of you. The cleanup team arrived at around 7 o'clock in the morning in a large, black truck. They wore plastic suits, gloves and shoe covers, like forensic scientists. Masks covered their noses and mouths, and large, reflective glasses hid the rest of their faces. They didn't speak. Not even to each other. Jeremy and the other kids sat in a corner, trying to look a little stunned. Now and then, Odd couldn't help himself, and burst out laughing. That may have been precisely what made their little game of pretend look so convincing. Jeremy stared at Dido as one of the agents took the memory-snatching machine and used it on her. For several minutes, the small digital screen on the back of the gloves filled with fast-scrolling text, while the woman bent backwards as if a strong electrical charge was rushing through her body. Her final glance was at Jeremy, and the boy swore he could see a smile on her lips. After that, Dido ended up like the others, somewhat disoriented and confused. They led her into a van with Lone Wolf, Weasel, Ferret and the rest of the men in black. The terrorists were handcuffed and piled into a truck to be brought to the police station. Then it was the children's parents' turn, who boarded a helicopter to be taken to their respective homes. Professor Hertz, Richard, Anthea, Jeremy and all the others got into a minibus that took them to Kadic. The cleanup agents were rather scary. They all looked the same and were very quiet, but they knew how to do their job. In a short amount of time they had disposed of Mago's nomadic tent and the terrorists' gunpowder. They even worked on the factory bridge to leave it looking exactly as it had before the explosion, in such a way that the inhabitants of this part of Paris wouldn't notice the difference. Jeremy thought that, in a few days, this place would be identical to as it had been for so many years. All trace of their adventures was destined to be completely erased. And maybe that was for the best. Finally, one of the agents started the minibus and set off towards Kadic. Jeremy turned to take one last look at the factory on the small island, with its roof flooded with sunlight and the mysterious air about it that had always fascinated him. The river water flowed peacefully, and on the other side of the river, he could see the same traffic as always, full of beeping cars and motorbikes ducking in and out dangerously between other vehicles. Jeremy had all his friends by his side. Everything was perfect. Epilogue, a party with a surprise. It was 10 in the morning on Sunday, and the airport in this region of Paris was filled with people. There were tired tourists lugging around big suitcases behind them and businessmen moving with ease and determination past the counters, policemen, and departure gates. There were pilots and flight attendants in their impeccable uniforms with small, professional-looking, wheeled suitcases. as well as throngs of students and chauffeurs holding up small signs with all sorts of names written on them to catch the attention of a client arriving from who knows where. Odd was also holding up a small sign, one that read, EVA Skinner. By his side were Principal Delmas and Jim Morales, the physical education teacher. Suddenly, Jim extended an arm towards the screens that indicated the arrivals and departures of the flights. "There it is," he exclaimed. "The flight from San Francisco just landed." Odd couldn't contain his joy. It had been more than 20 days since he had last seen Eva, and it had felt like a real eternity. Dido had erased the memories of the principal, teachers and all the students of Kadic. They had woken up with headaches and a bit of confusion after what seemed to them to have been a long dream. The men in black had done a good job. They had left the school like new, and the mess caused by the Green Phoenix had all simply vanished. The following day, 2 agents from Interpol came to the principal's office. Eva's parents had gone to the police after she had run away. For over a month now, the young girl's face had been among the thousands of photos of missing persons at police stations around the world. The Interpol agents calmed the principal down, promising him that no complaints would be filed against him, complaints, of course, that the principal would not be able to answer given that he didn't even remember that a student named Eva Skinner was registered at Kadic. This was the promise that Jeremy had obtained from Dido before the woman wiped everyone's memories. And she had kept her word. Someone had spoken with Mr. Skinner, who was a renowned lawyer, and convinced him to withdraw his complaint. At first, Mr. Skinner was furious and called Principal Delmas on the phone in a fit of rage, but then he chose to accept the Men in Black's offer, a scholarship for Eva to attend Kadic Academy, paid in full by the government. Mr. Skinner thought it was a rather good idea ultimately. Eva seemed so happy when he finally saw her again. "I'm still not very convinced about all this," spouted Principal Delmas. "This Skinner seems like a very aggressive man to me. His phone call woke me up at 3 in the morning, and he was shouting at the top of his lungs." Odd turned and gave a smile that crossed his face from ear to ear. "Don't worry, sir, everything's already been arranged, right? The police closed the investigation, and Eva's parents are happy that she's registered at Kadic. They said European schools are much more chic." Odd then interrupted himself and began to jump on the spot. Look, there she is." The sliding doors that led to the baggage claim opened up, and the passengers from the San Francisco flight started to pass by them. Eva was pulling a small, wheeled suitcase, and was dressed in a light pink jacket that made her seem several years older. When she saw Odd, she waved her hand and ran towards him with her suitcase bouncing behind her. "I'm so glad to see you," she exclaimed in English while hugging him tight. Me too," muttered Odd in French. "Whatever it is you said. Idiot. I know you understood me just fine." Eva gave him a kiss on the cheek, took him by the hand, then gave a small nod to Jim and Principal Delmas. "Sir, my father gave me a letter for you to apologize for having been so rude. I'm sure you understand that with me having been missing for such a long time, my parents began to feel really desperate." Odd stopped listening to the conversation and focused on Eva's delicate fingers, interlaced with his own. All throughout his career of breaking hearts, the boy had managed to get a good number of girlfriends, but in general, it didn't take a long time before he would get bored. However, during all these days that he'd spent far from Eva, he hadn't stopped thinking about her for a second. And he felt like his chest was about to explode of joy. Eva was here, and she was here to stay. "You know what?" he whispered in her ear. "We already prepared your room in the dorms. It's the same one that Aelita once had now that she's living at the Hermitage with her mum." He gave a small laugh before continuing. "At first, it's a bit of a mess, because we need to go to bed early and respect a ton of rules. But I know all the ways around them." "What's that?" the gym teacher burst out. "You better watch it, kid, or you'll end up in detention for so long, you won't get out until your hair goes gray." Eva laughed, and Odd followed her. Then, Jim and Principal Delmas also broke out in laughter. Ulrich knocked timidly on the door to Professor Hertz's office with the back of his hand. "Enter," a masculine voice answered him from inside. The boy entered. The office was in its usual organized disarray with machines, books, beakers and microscopes placed all over the room, the floor included. Nearby the main table was a smaller one, a bit smaller, on which sat a laptop and a pile of neatly ordered papers. Behind the screen was Richard, who was working in total concentration. He was sitting on an unsteady pile of magazines and wearing thin-framed glasses that gave him a different air than usual, more adult-like and more serious. Upon seeing Ulrich, he stood and moved away from the computer. "Ah, it's you. Good. I wanted to speak with you actually." He motioned to invite him to sit, but the boy couldn't tell where, so he gathered several volumes of encyclopedias from the floor and piled them up so that he could sit on top. Ulrich stumbled. He didn't know where to start, but Richard cut him to the chase and began to talk at full speed. "I corrected your last science test, and I must say that things aren't going well. On the second question, you made a small mistake that I almost had to mark off, but then on the third..." "Oh no," Richard wanted to talk about school. Ulrich waved his hands to stop him. Whoa. I know that you're Hertz's assistant now, and that you're taking your new job very seriously, but it's Sunday." The boy's interruption caught him by surprise, and Richard stopped to look at his watch. True, it is Sunday," he muttered. "I forgot. This is all still new to me, and juggling work with university isn't an easy thing." Ulrich felt himself smile. Professor Hertz hadn't forgotten a thing of what had happened recently, but she discovered a certain affinity for Richard, and several days after the battle for the factory, she offered him a job as her assistant. At first, he was a bit nervous, but he finally accepted. Ulrich knew that he felt right at ease at Kadic, and that in time, he would make a great teacher. "I came here as your friend, not your student," said the boy. "I wanted to invite you to dinner." "To dinner? You? But..." Ulrich gave a small laugh. "It's Anthea who told me to come. She and Aelita want to organize a dinner this evening to celebrate." Richard nodded his head. "A party? Tonight? Perfect. I'll bring the wine, okay? And, also some drinks for you guys. What time is it?" "At 8 o'clock at the Hermitage," exclaimed Ulrich as he left through the door. "Hello, it's Yumi." "Hello, Yumi," responded the calm voice of Anthea from the other side of the line. "How are you?" "All right. Can I speak with Aelita, please?" "I'm sorry, dear, but she's taking a short nap. She's very tired." Yumi glanced at the clock by her bedside. It was 6 o'clock in the afternoon. She was asleep at this hour? Yumi considered for a moment telling Aelita's mother about her problem, but realized that she couldn't. That would be too embarrassing. The young girl thanked Anthea and bade her goodbye. Then she stayed in place, playing with the wireless phone. There were only 2 more hours to go until the dinner, and she couldn't speak to Aelita. Now that she thought about it, she and Jeremy hadn't been around all weekend. Yumi hadn't managed to find them anywhere. And she didn't know who to ask for help. Eva maybe? Yeah, right. Yumi rejected this idea immediately. She had just returned to Kadic this morning, and had her glued to him from the first instant. What's more, she was a major fashion victim, and instead of helping her, Eva would have broken out in laughter. The truth was that Yumi didn't have the slightest idea how to dress. Ulrich would come looking for her at 7:15 to go to the party. For Yumi, this would be a really special occasion. After the battle against the terrorists, she and Ulrich hadn't yet had the occasion to talk about their feelings for each other. Yumi felt as if something about her had changed, something that was becoming stronger. In the minibus that had brought them to Kadic, leaving the abandoned factory forever behind them, the boy had sat by her side and held her hand. He had become more sure of himself, more bold. What should she wear? She wanted Ulrich to realize that she had made herself pretty for their get-together. Maybe she needed to put on some makeup. But she didn't even know where to start. At that moment, she heard a knocking at her door, and her mother entered immediately afterward, with bare feet and a cup of steaming hot tea in her hand. The tea smelled like jasmine, Yumi's favorite. "Is everything all right?" Akiko asked her. Yumi gave her a smile. Her parents didn't remember anything that had happened over these past few days, but something had stayed with them, like a sort of well of emotions. The family had become more united, and there was more harmony at home. Yumi and Hiroki, her younger brother, had stopped fighting, and her mother seemed to be much more sympathetic. Yumi had spoken with Ulrich and the others, and they all had had the same impression. The memory-snatching device had erased all the bad things and left the good. "Well," sighed the young girl. "I don't know how to dress elegantly for tonight. I mean, I'd look good in the kimono from that my aunt gave me for Christmas, but I don't want to look." Akiko kneeled on the floor close to her and placed a hand on her shoulder, interrupting her. "It's for Ulrich, right?" "Yes. Can I ask how you two met?" Yumi began to tell her. She told her mother about the afternoon in the gymnasium when she and Ulrich had faced each other in a martial arts bout, and how she ended up battling him. Akiko laughed. "So, this boy fell in love with you because he realized how you're good at what you do. If you ask me, you don't need an elegant kimono to get his attention. What really interests him is how you are on the inside. But if you want, I could give you a hand with your hair. We'll keep it Yumi style, but give it a more special touch." Yumi smiled. She and Akiko stood and hugged. The guests arrived around 8 o'clock. First, Eva, Richard and Odd, who was carrying his little dog, Kiwi, in his arms, then Ulrich and Yumi. Jeremy went to open the door for them and realized that Ulrich was a bit grumpy. "What happened?" he asked as he passed by the group. "Well, nothing really," his friend spoke softly. "Just that I didn't notice Yumi's beautiful new hairpins that she had in her hair, and she gave me a good punch." Jeremy laughed. Yumi and Ulrich, always the same. In the middle of the Hermitage's living room was a long table with a charming tablecloth and a bunch of delicious food. Odd stared at it with the eyes of a hungry wolf. "It won't be easy to do justice to all of this food," he exclaimed. Eva replied with a nudge, "But if you make it to my pork, you'll swallow every last bit." Aelita descended down the stairs wearing a sweater and an elegant, pink skirt. She still had sleepy eyes, but she was smiling and seemed to be doing extremely well, radiant with happiness. Finally, Yumi greeted her. "I was looking for you everywhere this afternoon, you know that?" "And I was looking for you, Jeremy," added Odd. "Mind telling us what you two were up to all weekend?" The boy responded with a mysterious smile and pulled out a chair for Aelita, so that she could sit by his side. It was quite a perfect dinner. Anthea came out from the kitchen glowing with joy. "I have to admit that, despite the fact that I've recovered my memory, my wonderful recipes never returned to me. So, I ordered everything from an amazing restaurant nearby. I hope you all like it." The children applauded. Indeed, everything was delicious. They stuffed themselves, and Richard and Odd competed to see who could eat the most slices of roast beef. The competition ended in wild cheers, and the indisputable victory went to Odd for having eaten 9 slices against 7. Before moving on to dessert, the children decided to take a break and remain seated at the table, talking. A bit later, as expected, the conversation centered on their adventures, particularly on their battle against Mago and the Code Down. "What I regret the most," Ulrich said, "is that XANA isn't here with us. I mean, at first, I didn't like him at all, with his air of superiority and all that. Plus, he had been our enemy for a long time. But in the end, I realized that he had really changed, and he proved to us that he was a good person." "I think the same thing," continued Odd. "When we were all running along the bridge to Lyoko, and I was on my super cool panther, XANA approached me and gave me some advice for the battle ahead. And you won't believe it, but we even laughed. Even though Lyoko was falling to pieces then, because Grigory had just shut down the supercomputer. Yeah, confirmed Yumi. I thought that after the code down I would miss Lyoko a lot, because of all these adventures that we went on. And yet, Lyoko doesn't matter to me in the least. What I really miss is XANA, our friend. At that moment, Jeremy stood and rang his fork against a glass to call for silence. He and Aelita had been waiting for this moment all evening, and the time had finally arrived to share their news with everyone. "Tell me something," exclaimed the boy. "Haven't you been wondering what the codes that we found in Richard's Palm computer contained?" In the living room of the Hermitage, a large uproar took over. Everyone began to talk at the same time. A mischievous smile grew on Jeremy's face, and he let Anthea explain the first part of the mystery. "Hannibal Mago ordered me to study them, and while analyzing them, I understood that it was a program divided into two parts. The first was an activation code, and the second was completely incomprehensible. It was clear to me that this program's purpose was to activate something, but I had no clue as to what." Jeremy continued, "Later on, Anthea and I worked together on deciphering the codes, and I realized that she was completely right. The last part of the codes didn't seem to make any sense, as if it was only a ton of random letters and numbers. So, I told myself that maybe it was just that. It seemed like one very, very, very long password." "A password?" asked Richard. "But why? To protect what?" "I don't know if you remember this one scene that we saw in the mirror," Aelita intervened this time. "But in it, my father had problems making a backup copy, and needed more space to stock an excessive quantity of information. An amount of space that no hard drive was capable of supplying him." Yumi jumped to her feet. "Of course," she exclaimed. "And so, you told him that you would help him, and that he could count on you. And in the next scene, you were lying down on the couch, and had a fever, and then the men in black arrived." "Exactly," said Aelita. "Daddy needed more space, so he and I decided to use my brain." The room was overtaken by absolute silence. Jeremy smiled. "Remember the memory snatching device? Well, Hopper used it to pour all the supercomputer's programming code into Aelita's mind. He practically copied all of Lyoko into Aelita's brain. And, to avoid having this information stolen by anyone, he protected it with a password that he then sent to Richard. That's why I was burning up with a fever in the mirror," explained Aelita. "And also why I spent all afternoon sleeping today. I left yesterday with Jeremy in secret, and we returned to the old factory, to recreate Lyoko. All of its sectors, its towers, and its core. And even the first city." It was incredible news. Jeremy observed the bewildered faces of his friends. He had also had trouble believing that such a thing were possible, to be able to reconstruct Lyoko with a code identical and opposed to that of the code down. That was the reason why Aelita had always suffered from sudden spells of amnesia. Her brain was literally crammed full of millions and millions of pieces of data, just like an armoire stuffed so full that it was impossible to close all the way. When Jeremy had realized that Richard's codes were in reality a password, he imagined that Hopper must have prepared a security system to protect his invention from the men in black, but he hadn't the slightest idea that the professor had in reality copied every last bit of Lyoko, enclosing and locking it away in Aelita. Everything went so fast after that with the battle and all the rest that he hadn't gotten back to this puzzle until. "And XANA?" asked Ulrich. That's right, XANA," Odd added. "He told us that he couldn't make a backup copy of his new identity because he became human." XANA would say that's true. But the final words that he spoke to Aelita before dying gave me an ingenious idea. He said, "Remember me." Maybe XANA knew all about the codes, or maybe he sensed the truth. Or maybe he was trying to guess at it and found the solution to this mystery by chance. Remember me. Besides having all of Lyoko in her memory, Aelita was also XANA's best friend. You could say that no one knew better than her, especially with his new human personality. At this moment, Aelita smiled and Jeremy stopped for a second to look at her lovingly before continuing. When we recreated Lyoko, we only needed to take advantage of all the information in the rest of her brain too. The boy was on the point of launching himself into a scientific exposé of the highest level, but Aelita motioned for him to stop. I think that it would be easier to show them directly, don't you think? Come with me to the basement, to my father's secret room. We have another guest on the way to eat dessert with us. He has blonde hair, and has been stuck on Lyoko for a very, very long time. He must be about to come out of the scanner.
And there we have it, the finale of the Lyoko book reading. To say everything had a happy ending would be an understatement. Odd and Eva are together, Richard became Hertz's assistant, Anthea is alive, living with Aelita, and even in the end they were able to recreate Lyoko and bring XANA to Earth. Pretty sure hopefully XANA will adapt living on Earth amongst the humans. And lastly, all the terrorists in the Ring Phoenix got their just desserts, arrested, jailed, and memory taken. Going back to what they said about the government going to use the first city to have an advantage in world wars really makes sense. And using the code down to kill Lyoko shows just how much a pacifist Frank Hopper actually is. So after a month of leaving off the previous episode, I think it was time to make the finale episode to wrap up and close the book on this great big adventure. I want to thank the team at Kurisu.fr for decoding and translating the entire book series from French and Italian. Without the team, the fan translations into English would not have been possible. And, as usual, you can find the link to the download at Kurisu.fr in the description of the video on all the episodes for the book reading. Special thanks to Nell Basia, Queen of Fairies, and the Kurisu team for the visuals, and Media Tune, Moon Group, and Roro XANA for the music. This was honestly a real blast to make, and I'm glad that my audience enjoyed the series. If you guys want me to recreate the past episodes, let me know in the comments. What did you think of the adventure? Give it a like, subscribe, and share with your friends. The full playlist of the entire book reading is in the description. Go ahead and give it a listen. And as always, I will see you all in the next episode. See ya.
So long!